Welcome to Forgotten Soul History Channel, where we uncover the stories buried beneath time and silence. Tonight, we travel back into the shadows of early America. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time they are right now. If you have not subscribed, please subscribe and like this video so you do not miss the hidden stories history tried to forget. In the late 18th century, the Caribbean island known as Saint-Domingue was the richest colony in the world. It was not rich because of gold mines or silver mountains. It was rich because of sugar. Endless fields of sugarcane stretched across the plains, especially in the northern province, near the shining coastal city of Cap Haitien, which at that time was called Cap Français. Ships crowded its harbor every week, carrying barrels of sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton across the Atlantic to France and other parts of Europe. The sweet taste of Caribbean sugar filled the cups of Parisian salons and European royal courts. The wealth seemed unstoppable, but beneath that shining surface was a system built on unimaginable cruelty. Saint-Domingue depended on enslaved African labor. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were forced to work from sunrise to sunset under brutal supervision. They cut cane with sharp blades in the burning sun. They worked in boiling houses where sugar was processed in unbearable heat. They slept in small huts with little food and almost no medical care. Life expectancy was shockingly low. Many enslaved people did not survive more than a few years after arriving from Africa. The colony replaced the dead with more captives, shipped across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. The social structure of Saint-Domingue was sharply divided. At the top were the white Grand Blancs, wealthy plantation owners who controlled vast estates and enormous fortunes. Below them were the Petits Blancs, poor whites who worked as overseers, artisans, or shopkeepers. Then there were the free people of color, some of whom owned property, and even slaves themselves, but were denied equal rights because of racial laws. At the very bottom were the enslaved Africans, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population. Fear held this system together. Fear of punishment, fear of revolt, fear of losing wealth. By the 1780s, tensions were rising. Enslaved Africans carried with them memories of kingdoms, religions, and military traditions from West and Central Africa. They communicated through songs, whispered messages, and nighttime gatherings. Maroon communities, groups of escaped enslaved people, hid in mountains and forests. They raided plantations and inspired others to dream freedom. Planters responded with stricter laws and harsher punishments. But fear is a dangerous tool. When it is used for too long, it creates strength in those who endure it. In 1788, inside a grand plantation house near Cap Français, a violent act would shake the confidence of the colonial elite. The house belonged to a powerful planter family. It was known for hosting elegant banquets. On that particular evening, guests arrived dressed in silk and fine linen. Candles lit the hall. Crystal glasses clinked. Musicians played soft European melodies. The masters believed themselves secure. Armed guards stood outside. The enslaved servants moved quietly between tables, pouring wine and serving roasted meat. To the guests, these servants seemed invisible, obedient, silent, controlled. Among the servants was a man who had spent years observing the behavior of the masters. He had witnessed punishments in the fields. He had heard screams from whipping posts. He had seen families torn apart at auction. His silence had been mistaken for submission. But inside him, something had changed. The belief that the system was permanent had begun to fade. As laughter filled the hall, the servant stepped closer to the head of the table. What happened next unfolded in seconds. A blade flashed in candlelight. A cry shattered the music. Blood spilled onto polished wood floors. Panic erupted. Chairs crashed. Women screamed. Guards rushed inside. The illusion of control disappeared in a single violent moment. The act itself was shocking, but its meaning was even more powerful. For years, planters believed that fear flowed in only one direction, from master to enslaved. That night, fear changed direction. The masters realized that someone they trusted enough to serve wine could also raise a weapon. The boundary between obedience and rebellion was thinner than they imagined. News of the attack spread quickly across the northern province. Planters held emergency meetings. Patrols increased. Laws tightened. Punishments became harsher. Public executions were staged to remind enslaved people of the consequences of rebellion. Yet repression could not erase what had happened. The idea had entered the air. Masters were not invincible. At the same time, across the Atlantic, France was approaching its own crisis. Economic hardship, inequality, and political unrest were building. By 1789, the French Revolution would explode, declaring ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Those words would travel across oceans. In Saint-Domingue, free people of color demanded equal rights. White colonists argued among themselves about representation and power, and enslaved Africans listened carefully. Secret meetings multiplied. Religious ceremonies blended African spiritual traditions with the realities of plantation life. Leaders began to emerge, men and women who understood both African warfare and European strategy. They studied weaknesses in the colonial system. They mapped plantations in their minds. They waited. The 1788 banquet attack did not cause the Haitian Revolution by itself, but it symbolized something deeper: the collapse of psychological certainty. Revolutions are not born only from hunger or anger. They are born when people begin to believe that change is possible. In Saint-Domingue, that belief was spreading quietly through cane fields and slave quarters. By August 1791, the northern plain erupted in coordinated rebellion. Plantations burned through the night. Smoke darkened the sky. Thousands of enslaved people rose in arms. The colonial army struggled to respond. Chaos spread. France, now in revolution itself, could not easily control its richest colony. Out of this violence emerged remarkable leaders. One of the most extraordinary was Toussaint Louverture. Born enslaved, he educated himself, learned military tactics, and became a brilliant strategist. Under his command, formerly enslaved soldiers defeated European armies sent by France, Spain, and Britain. His leadership transformed rebellion into organized revolution. Later, after Louverture was captured and sent to France where he died in prison, the struggle continued under leaders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The war grew even more intense. Napoleon Bonaparte attempted to reassert French control and restore slavery. But the resistance was relentless. Yellow fever devastated French troops. Haitian fighters used knowledge of the land to their advantage. Finally, on January 1st, 1804, independence was declared. The colony of Saint-Domingue became Haiti, the first independent black republic in the world. It was a victory that shocked global powers. It proved that enslaved people could overthrow one of the strongest colonial systems on earth. But independence came with heavy consequences. Many nations refused to recognize Haiti. France demanded a massive financial indemnity in exchange for diplomatic recognition in 1825. That debt burdened Haiti's economy for generations. Still, The psychological impact of the revolution could not be undone. Enslaved people across the Americas heard the news. Slaveholders feared similar uprisings. Abolition movements gained strength. When we look back to that candlelit banquet hall in 1788, we see more than an isolated act of violence. We see a warning shot fired into the heart of a brutal system. We see a moment when fear shifted. The masters learned they were vulnerable. The enslaved learned they were capable. History often remembers revolutions by their largest battles, but revolutions are built from smaller moments. Whispers, glances, acts of courage that seem small at the time. The Haitian Revolution was not born overnight. It grew from decades of suffering, resistance, and awakening. The sugar fields that once symbolized wealth became battlefields. The grand houses that once hosted elegant dinners became ruins. The island that fed Europe's sweet tooth became a symbol of black freedom and resilience. And it all began with a change in belief. The belief that no system is eternal. The belief that silence can hide strength. The belief that even in the darkest conditions, people can imagine freedom. To understand what truly happened in 1788, we must step inside Saint-Domingue as it existed before the storm. The colony was not just wealthy. It was the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean, and perhaps the richest plantation economy in the world. It belonged to France, and its profits flowed constantly into French ports like Bordeaux and Nantes. Ships crossed the Atlantic loaded with sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton. On paper, Saint-Domingue looked like a miracle of prosperity. In reality, it was a machine powered by human suffering. Nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans labored under brutal conditions so that fewer than 40,000 white colonists could live in luxury. The northern province, with its capital at Cap Français, now called Cap Haitien, was the beating heart of this system. Grand plantation houses stood like palaces. Chandeliers hung from ceilings imported from Europe. Silverware and crystal filled dining rooms. Musicians played for elite gatherings, but outside those walls, in the cane fields stretching to the horizon, bodies broke under whips and heat. The plantation where the banquet would take place was one of the largest in the northern plain. Its owner was part of the Grands Blancs, the powerful white elite who controlled land, politics, and militia forces. He had been born in France and had come to Saint-Domingue seeking fortune. Like many planters, he saw the colony not as a home, but as an opportunity. His wealth depended entirely on enslaved labor. Dozens of enslaved men cut cane from dawn until night. Women worked in boiling houses where sugar was processed in suffocating heat. Children carried water and tools. Death was common. Replacement was constant. The Atlantic slave trade fed the system, bringing thousands of captives from West and Central Africa each year. Many arrived speaking languages from regions such as Senegambia, the Congo Basin, and the Bight of Benin. They carried memories of their homelands, spiritual traditions, and knowledge of resistance. The plantation owner saw only numbers and output. He calculated profit in barrels and shipments. He did not calculate the cost in rage building silently beneath the surface. Inside the great house worked a smaller group of enslaved people, assigned to domestic labor. Among them was the man later identified in colonial fragments as Jean-Paul. His name may not have been his birth name. Many enslaved people were given Christian names by their masters, often after saints or French relatives. His original African name, if recorded anywhere, has been lost. But what we know from plantation patterns is this: domestic servants occupied a unique and dangerous position. They were close to power. They heard conversations at dinner tables. They served wine during political discussions. They dressed their masters and overheard complaints about trade laws and rumors of unrest. This proximity did not mean comfort. It meant constant observation. One mistake could lead to whipping or sale, yet it also meant knowledge. Knowledge of fear. Knowledge of division among whites. Knowledge that masters were not united in everything. In 1788, that knowledge mattered. The colony at that time was tense. News traveled slowly across the Atlantic, but rumors moved quickly between plantations. France was facing financial crisis. There were arguments in Paris about taxation and reform. Free people of color in Saint-Domingue were petitioning for greater civil rights. They were often educated, sometimes wealthy, and they resented discrimination by white colonists. The white elite themselves were divided between those who wanted more autonomy from France and those loyal to royal authority. Beneath all of this, the enslaved majority watched. They did not participate in formal assemblies, but they observed everything. Night gatherings in slave quarters became spaces of coded discussion. Drums carried messages. Spiritual ceremonies blended African traditions with Catholic symbols imposed by law. Planters sensed tension. They increased patrols. They punished suspected dissent harshly. But repression cannot erase awareness. It often sharpens it. Jean-Paul's daily life likely moved between obedience and silent calculation. As a domestic servant, he would have woken before sunrise. He would have prepared rooms, polished silver, assisted cooks, and ensured that everything in the master's world appeared orderly. He would have stood quietly behind chairs during meals, eyes lowered, ears open. He would have witnessed how masters spoke about enslaved people as property. He would have heard laughter when punishments were described. He would have seen guests boast about productivity and discipline. These moments accumulate, humiliation layered upon humiliation, rage pressed down by necessity, fear enforced by violence. The psychology of enslavement depended on convincing the enslaved that resistance was impossible. Yet, each day inside the house also revealed cracks. Masters argued. Masters drank heavily. Masters worried about rumors of poisonings on nearby plantations. Masters read letters from France expressing anxiety. The illusion of absolute control required constant reinforcement. The banquet planned in 1788 was meant to display confidence. Invitations were sent to prominent planters and colonial officials in the northern province. The guest list included men who controlled hundreds of enslaved workers. Some held positions in local councils. Others commanded militia units, responsible for suppressing unrest. The dinner would celebrate economic success and reinforce unity among the elite. Such gatherings were political as much as social. They were moments to discuss trade policies, taxation disputes with France, and strategies for managing the enslaved population. They were also performances of power, performances of civilization. Fine wine imported from Europe would be poured. Musicians would play softly. Laughter would fill the hall. Servants would move silently between tables, invisible yet essential. On the day of the banquet, the plantation house was transformed. Candles were arranged carefully in polished holders. White linen covered long tables. Roasted meats, tropical fruits, and elaborate desserts were prepared in the kitchens. Domestic servants, including Jean-Paul, rehearsed their movements. Timing mattered. Silence mattered. Any error could result in punishment after guests departed. Outside, in the quarters, enslaved field workers sensed something important was happening. They saw carriages arriving. They heard music drifting into the night air. For them, such events symbolized the distance between their suffering and the luxury inside the house. For the elite, the banquet symbolized stability. Yet beneath the polished surface lay a colony already trembling. Colonial court records from the late 1780s reveal increasing prosecutions of enslaved people accused of conspiracy or poisoning. Planters feared organized revolt. Some believed maroon communities in the mountains were growing stronger. Others worried about communication between plantations. The memory of earlier slave revolts in the Caribbean, including those in Jamaica, haunted their discussions. They reassured one another that Saint-Domingue's discipline was strong enough to prevent large-scale uprising, but reassurance often hides doubt. As evening settled and guests took their seats, Jean-Paul moved among them with practiced calm. He poured wine into crystal glasses. He adjusted plates. He stood within arm's reach of men who discussed profits earned from sugar shipments bound for France. He listened as they debated the demands of free people of color for equal rights. Some dismissed those demands with contempt. Others warned that division among whites could weaken their control. At some point during the meal, conversation reportedly turned toward rumors of slave unrest. One guest laughed that enslaved people were too frightened to act. Another insisted that harsh discipline guaranteed obedience. The words hung in the air. What passed through Jean-Paul's mind in that moment can never be fully known. History preserves fragments, not thoughts. But we can understand the environment that shaped him. He lived in a world where his body was owned, where his family could be sold, where punishment could be inflicted without appeal, where law defined him as property under the Code Noir established decades earlier during the reign of Louis XIV. He also lived in a world where tension was rising, where rumors of change drifted from France, where free people of color challenged discrimination, and where enslaved communities whispered of resistance. He stood in a room filled with men who believed they were untouchable. The decision to act, when it came, would alter more than one life. It would puncture the psychological shield surrounding the colonial elite. It would demonstrate that proximity could become opportunity. Domestic service placed him near the master's body, near enough to strike. The banquet hall, symbol of dominance, would become the stage for defiance. In 1788, before the flames of 1791, before the leadership of Toussaint Louverture and the eventual Declaration of Independence, there was this moment, a servant, a blade, and a room full of power unprepared for vulnerability. Understanding that night requires understanding the structure of fear that defined Saint-Domingue. Fear enforced obedience in the fields. Fear justified patrols at night. Fear underpinned the entire economy that enriched France. But fear is unstable. When those who are meant to fear begin to see weakness, the balance shifts. The banquet was intended to reinforce confidence among the elite. Instead, it exposed how thin that confidence truly was. In the next chapter, we will witness the instant when illusions shattered and the colony began to sense that the ground beneath it was no longer solid. The scream that followed the stabbing did not sound like the cry of a dying man. It sounded like the sound of power breaking. The guests at the banquet in Cap Français, now called Cap Haitien, froze in disbelief. For years they had spoken of enslaved people as property, as tools, as bodies without will. Yet in that single moment in 1788, one of those bodies had acted with decision and force. Witness accounts from colonial archives described chairs falling, wine glasses shattering, and silk coats stained with blood. Some guests ran toward the doors. Others grabbed the attacker. The master lay on the polished floor, gasping, his lifeblood spreading across tiles imported from France. The musicians stopped playing. The illusion of safety vanished. Jean-Paul did not flee. That detail appears again and again in the fragments of testimony recorded by colonial officials. He was seized almost immediately by other servants and armed guards who rushed into the hall. Some sources suggest he said nothing. Others claim he spoke calmly, declaring that no man had the right to own another. It is impossible to confirm his exact words, but what is certain is this: the attack was not random. It was deliberate. Colonial judges later wrote that the accused showed no visible fear during capture. That disturbed them more than the violence itself. Fear was supposed to control the enslaved. When fear failed, the system trembled. The wounded master did not survive the night. His death spread through Cap Français by morning. Church bells rang, not in celebration but in warning. The elite of Saint-Domingue understood the meaning of the act. This was not only murder, it was a message. In 1788, the colony already lived with anxiety. There had been reports of maroon communities hiding in the mountains. There were small uprisings crushed in silence. There were trials of enslaved men accused of poisoning overseers. Plantation owners wrote letters to contacts in Paris complaining about unrest and demanding stronger enforcement of the Code Noir, first established under Louis XIV. But now, the violence had entered their dining rooms. The colonial court moved quickly. A public example had to be made. Jean-Paul was taken to prison in Cap Français, interrogated, and prepared for trial. The charge was not only murder, but rebellion against the natural order, as defined by the colony. Under the brutal justice system of Saint-Domingue, enslaved people accused of attacking whites faced torture before execution. Officials believed that punishment must be visible to restore fear. Yet something unexpected happened during the proceedings. Crowds gathered, not only to witness condemnation, but to whisper. Enslaved dock workers, market women, field hands brought into town, they all heard the story. A man had struck his master in front of the powerful and had not begged for mercy. That story began to travel faster than ships crossing the Atlantic, and stories, once alive, are harder to kill than men. The trial began within days, inside the colonial courthouse of Cap Français, now known as Cap Haitien. The building stood tall, a symbol of French authority in Saint-Domingue. Judges wore powdered wigs and heavy robes, despite the tropical heat. They believed the law was on their side. Under the Code Noir, created during the reign of Louis XIV, enslaved people were property. Property could not legally raise a hand against its owner. The courtroom filled with plantation owners, merchants, and military officers. They did not come only for justice. They came for reassurance. They needed to see that control would be restored. Jean-Paul was brought in chains. His wrists were bruised. His back showed marks from interrogation. Yet witnesses recorded that he walked upright, not dragging his feet, not collapsing in tears. That detail disturbed the observers more than anything else. Interrogation in Saint-Domingue was brutal. Colonial records show that enslaved prisoners accused of violent resistance were often subjected to torture to force confession. Whipping, stretching on wooden frames, and other painful methods were used to break the body and extract names of accomplices. Authorities believed there had to be a larger conspiracy. They refused to accept that one man alone could strike so boldly. They asked him again and again who had planned it, who had met in secret, who had promised freedom. But no wide network was ever proven in the surviving documents. This silence frightened the elite. If he acted alone, then rebellion could live inside any enslaved person without warning. Outside the courthouse, tension grew. Enslaved workers in the city heard every rumor. Market women whispered while selling fruit. Dock workers paused while loading ships bound for Bordeaux and Nantes. The story traveled to nearby plantations. It reached the cane fields where men cut sugar under armed watch. For many enslaved people, the act carried deep meaning. It showed that fear was not permanent. It showed that masters could bleed. At the same time, white colonists increased patrols. Militia units marched through streets at night. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Letters were sent to officials in Paris, warning that discipline must be tightened before greater disaster struck. The verdict was never truly in doubt. In 1788, colonial justice did not protect enslaved Africans. It protected property and power. Jean-Paul was sentenced to public execution. The method was meant to terrify. Punishment would be carried out in the main square so that both enslaved and free residents would witness the cost of rebellion. But what the judges failed to understand was this: public punishment does not only create fear, it also creates memory, and memory can become fuel. As the day of execution approached, something invisible began to spread across Saint-Domingue. It was not yet revolution, but it was no longer silence. The morning of the execution arrived heavy and silent over Cap Français, now known as Cap Haitien. The square was prepared before sunrise. Soldiers stood in formation, with muskets ready. Plantation owners arrived in carriages, dressed formally, determined to show confidence, even as anxiety tightened their faces. Enslaved workers were forced to attend in large numbers. The authorities believed that fear must be renewed in public. The message was simple: any challenge to white authority would be crushed without mercy. In 1788, Saint-Domingue depended on terror to function. Sugar profits flowed to France, and that wealth demanded obedience. Jean-Paul was brought forward in chains. Witness descriptions from colonial punishment records show that executions for enslaved rebels were often cruel and prolonged. Some were broken on the wheel. Others were burned. Some were hanged and displayed as warning. The exact method in this case is not perfectly preserved in surviving fragments, but historians confirm that public executions in Saint-Domingue were designed to shock. The crowd watched closely. Some white spectators expected to see tears, begging, collapse. Instead, reports describe a man who remained steady. That steadiness unsettled the authorities, because if a condemned slave could stand without visible fear, what did that mean for the thousands watching? Among the enslaved crowd, silence carried deeper meaning than screams. Men and women who cut cane under whips saw something new that day. They saw the colony forced to respond. They saw the masters shaken enough to gather soldiers in the streets. They saw power exposed as vulnerable. In 1788, tension was already rising across the Atlantic. News from Paris spoke of economic crisis and political arguments that would soon explode into the French Revolution in 1789. Ideas of rights and liberty were beginning to circulate. Free people of color in Saint-Domingue demanded equal treatment. Enslaved Africans listened. Even those who could not read understood the meaning of instability. When the execution was carried out, the square did not erupt in rebellion. There was no immediate uprising. The colony returned to work. Sugar continued to be harvested. Ships continued to sail, but something invisible had shifted. Fear had changed direction. Before, fear belonged mostly to the enslaved. Now, fear lived inside the grand houses as well. Planters increased night patrols. They limited gatherings. They punished suspected dissent more quickly. Yet repression often strengthens resistance. Within 3 years, in 1791, a massive slave uprising would begin in the northern plains, near a wooded area remembered as Bois Cayman. Leaders such as Toussaint Louverture would emerge from that chaos. The Haitian Revolution would become the only successful slave revolt in world history, eventually creating the independent nation of Haiti. The act in 1788 did not cause the revolution alone, but it revealed a truth. The system was not unbreakable, and once that truth is seen, it can never be unseen. In the years that followed the execution in 1788, the colony of Saint-Domingue did not return to true calm. On the surface, life appeared normal. Sugarcane continued to sway in the hot wind across the northern plains. Ships still crowded the harbor of Cap Français, now known as Cap Haitien. Plantation owners still hosted dinners beneath crystal chandeliers and spoke confidently about profits flowing to France. Yet beneath this appearance of order, something irreversible had shifted. The execution of the enslaved servant who struck his master in front of elite guests had done more than punish a man. It had exposed vulnerability. The Grand Blancs, the powerful white plantation class, began to sense that control maintained only through terror could crack without warning. Letters preserved from the late 1780s reveal increasing anxiety among planters. They complained about rumors spreading among enslaved workers. They wrote of strange gatherings at night, of drums heard faintly in distant hills, of coded songs sung in fields. They described fear, not only of violence, but of ideas. At the same time, the world beyond Saint-Domingue was changing rapidly. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted in Paris. Crowds stormed the Bastille. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was proclaimed. Words like liberty, equality, and rights traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. For white colonists in Saint-Domingue, these ideas were complicated. Many Grand Blancs supported more local autonomy from France. They wanted freedom for themselves, especially economic freedom. They resented trade restrictions, but they did not want equality for free people of color, and they certainly did not want freedom for enslaved Africans. The contradiction was clear. They demanded liberty while defending slavery. Free people of color, many of whom were educated and owned property, began to push harder for equal civil rights. Tension between white colonists and free people of color intensified. Enslaved Africans watched closely. They may not have read printed declarations, but they understood the language of conflict. Between 1789 and 1791, Saint-Domingue became a colony divided against itself. Political factions formed among whites. Some supported the revolutionary government in France. Others resisted it. Militia units clashed. Violence erupted in the streets of Cap Français. Meanwhile, conditions on plantations remained brutal. Workdays lasted from sunrise to sunset. Whippings continued. Families were separated. Mortality rates remained high. The enslaved population far outnumbered the white population, nearly 500,000 enslaved people to fewer than 40,000 whites. That imbalance haunted every planter's thoughts. The memory of the banquet stabbing in 1788 lingered like a warning. It had shown that rebellion could come from inside the house, not only from distant fields. Planters increased surveillance of domestic servants. They rotated trusted positions. They tightened discipline. But harshness does not erase anger. It deepens it. Secret networks expanded quietly. Enslaved people communicated across plantations through markets, religious gatherings, and work crews hired out temporarily. African spiritual traditions blended with Catholic elements imposed by colonists. Ceremonies carried layers of meaning that white observers often misunderstood. In August of 1791, representatives from several plantations in the northern region gathered in a wooded area later remembered as Bois Cayman. Accounts differ on exact details, but historians agree that this meeting played a key symbolic role in uniting resistance. A ritual oath was reportedly taken. Plans were discussed. Within days, plantations across the northern plains were set on fire. Cane fields burned. Smoke rose into the sky. Enslaved men and women seized weapons. Overseers were attacked. The uprising that began in 1791 was massive and coordinated in ways that stunned the colonial authorities. The fear that had grown since 1788 erupted into open war. The violence shocked the Atlantic world. News traveled quickly to France, to Spain, to Britain, and to the young United States. Saint-Domingue had been the richest colony in the Caribbean. Its sugar fueled European markets. Now it was in flames. Thousands of enslaved people joined the rebellion. Some leaders emerged with military skill and strategic vision. One of them was Toussaint Louverture. Born enslaved, he would rise to become one of the most powerful figures of the revolution. His intelligence and discipline transformed scattered revolts into organized campaigns. He navigated alliances between France, Spain, and Britain as these empires fought over control of the island. What began as an uprising for survival grew into a revolutionary struggle that challenged the very foundation of slavery in the Atlantic world. The connection between individual acts of resistance and large-scale revolution is not always direct. The banquet stabbing in 1788 did not alone cause the uprising of 1791. Yet it belongs to a pattern historians recognize clearly. Throughout the late 18th century, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue resisted in many forms. Some escaped to form maroon communities in mountains. Some sabotaged tools. Some poisoned livestock. Some attacked overseers. Each act carried risk. Each act carried message. The stabbing inside a grand house in front of elite guests struck at psychological control. It shattered the illusion that enslaved people were passive. That memory traveled by word of mouth. In societies built on silence, stories become weapons. As the rebellion expanded after 1791, the colony descended into complex warfare. White planters fled. Some sought refuge in cities like New Orleans and Charleston. Others sailed back to France. Free people of color formed their own armed groups. Spanish forces from neighboring Santo Domingo entered the conflict. British troops attempted invasion, hoping to capture the wealthy colony. Disease spread among European soldiers, unused to tropical climate. Yellow fever killed thousands. The struggle was not simple. Alliances shifted, loyalties changed, but the core demand of many formerly enslaved fighters became clearer over time. They wanted permanent freedom, not reform, not lighter punishment. Freedom. In 1794, under pressure from events in Saint-Domingue and broader revolutionary ideology, the French National Convention abolished slavery in all French colonies. This decision marked a turning point. It was the first time a major European power officially ended slavery across its empire. For enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, it offered temporary legal recognition of what they had already begun to claim by force. Yet the story did not end there. Political instability in France continued. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte attempted to restore slavery and reassert control over the colony. His expedition met fierce resistance. Leaders such as Jean-Jacques Dessalines fought relentlessly. After brutal warfare and immense loss of life, French forces were defeated. On January 1st, 1804, the independent nation of Haiti was declared. It became the first black republic and the first nation born from a successful slave revolt. The world reacted with shock and hostility. Slaveholding societies feared the example. Trade restrictions and diplomatic isolation followed. Haiti paid a heavy price for its freedom. Yet its existence proved that enslaved people could overthrow one of the most powerful colonial systems in the world. The revolution reshaped global conversations about slavery, race, and human rights. Looking back, historians see the years before 1791 as critical. They were years of testing limits, years when small sparks appeared before the wildfire. The banquet stabbing in 1788 stands as one such spark. It revealed cracks in the colonial facade. It forced the elite to confront vulnerability. It showed enslaved observers that resistance was possible, even in the heart of power. Fear changed direction that night, and once fear shifts, power shifts with it. The story of Saint-Domingue reminds us that revolutions do not appear suddenly without warning. They grow slowly beneath systems of injustice. They gather strength through memory and shared experience. Every whisper matters. Every act, however isolated it seems, becomes part of a larger current. The enslaved servant who raised his hand at a royal-style banquet in 1788 could not have predicted the full transformation that would follow. Yet his action belongs to the chain of courage that stretched from quiet defiance to open rebellion, from plantation fields to independence. When the flames of 1791 spread across the northern plains of Saint-Domingue, the world did not immediately understand what it was witnessing. Many European observers believed the uprising would collapse within weeks. They saw it as chaos, not revolution. They assumed that enslaved Africans lacked the discipline to sustain organized resistance. Yet the rebellion did not fade. It grew. Plantations that once fed enormous wealth into the ports of Bordeaux and Nantes burned in waves. Columns of smoke rose so high that sailors approaching Cap Français, now known as Cap Haitien, reported seeing black clouds before land. The colonial order that had seemed permanent in 1788 now appeared fragile. Those who had laughed confidently at banquets just 3 years earlier were fleeing with whatever silver and documents they could carry. The psychological shift that began with individual acts of defiance had matured into collective war. The rebellion in its early months was violent and unpredictable. Enslaved fighters destroyed symbols of plantation authority. Great houses were looted and set on fire. Overseers who had once wielded whips now faced machetes. Yet alongside rage, structure slowly emerged. Leaders rose not by birthright, but by ability. Among them, Toussaint Louverture began to distinguish himself. Unlike many fighters, he understood both African military traditions and European tactics. He could read and write. He studied maps. He grasped diplomacy. At first, the conflict in Saint-Domingue became entangled with broader imperial wars. Spain and Britain saw opportunity in France's weakness during the French Revolution. Spanish authorities in neighboring Santo Domingo recruited black fighters with promises of freedom. Britain attempted invasion, hoping to seize the wealthy colony. Saint-Domingue became a battlefield not only of liberation, but of global rivalry. Inside this storm, fear traveled in every direction. White colonists feared total destruction. Free people of color feared losing fragile gains in civil rights. European governments feared economic collapse. Slaveholding societies in the Americas feared the example of successful revolt. In cities like Charleston and New Orleans, newspapers followed events with alarm. Planters in Jamaica and Cuba tightened discipline. Laws restricting movement of enslaved people became harsher. The story of Saint-Domingue was no longer local. It was Atlantic. And in that widening circle of anxiety, memories of earlier resistance took on new meaning. The stabbing in 1788, once dismissed as isolated madness, now seemed like an omen. It had revealed that obedience was never absolute. Now that truth was visible on battlefields stretching from mountains to coast. By 1794, the political winds in France shifted dramatically. Under pressure from events in Saint-Domingue and the radical phase of the French Revolution, the National Convention abolished slavery in French colonies. This decision was extraordinary. It marked the first large European empire to formally end slavery. For many black fighters in Saint-Domingue, this legal change aligned with what they had already fought to claim. Toussaint Louverture allied himself with the French Republic, turning against Spain. His forces pushed back British troops, who suffered devastating losses from yellow fever and combat. Gradually, Toussaint consolidated control over much of the colony. Order replaced chaos in many regions. Plantations resumed limited production under new labor systems that attempted to balance freedom with economic survival. It was a fragile experiment, but it showed that formerly enslaved people could govern and command armies. Yet the struggle was far from over. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte, now ruler of France, sought to restore direct control and reimpose slavery. He dispatched a massive expeditionary force under his brother-in-law. Thousands of French soldiers arrived with orders to crush resistance and arrest black leaders. At first, some local commanders were deceived by promises that slavery would not return. But evidence soon revealed the truth. Slavery had already been restored in other French colonies. Trust evaporated. War resumed with brutal intensity. Toussaint Louverture was captured through deception and deported to France, where he died in prison in 1803. His removal, intended to break the revolution, instead hardened it. Leadership passed to generals such as Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who embraced total resistance. The final phase of the conflict was merciless. French forces attempted scorched earth tactics. Revolutionary armies responded with equal ferocity. Disease continued to ravage European troops. Yellow fever did what bullets could not, killing thousands unfamiliar with tropical conditions. Supply lines stretched thin across the Atlantic. Napoleon faced wars in Europe and could not sustain endless losses in the Caribbean. By late 1803, French power in Saint-Domingue collapsed. On January 1st, 1804, independence was declared. The new nation reclaimed the ancient indigenous name Haiti. The declaration was not merely political, it was symbolic. It rejected the colonial identity imposed by France. It announced to the world that enslaved people had defeated a European empire. The consequences were immediate and long-lasting. Slave-holding societies refused to recognize Haiti. Trade barriers isolated the new nation. In 1825, France forced Haiti to agree to a massive indemnity in exchange for diplomatic recognition, demanding compensation for former slave owners. This financial burden crippled Haiti's economy for generations. Yet, despite hardship, the symbolic power of Haiti's revolution could not be erased. It inspired enslaved and oppressed people across the Americas. It frightened slave owners into both repression and reform. It influenced debates about abolition in Europe. The ripple effects stretched far beyond the Caribbean. Looking back across the arc from 1788 to 1804, historians see a pattern of escalating courage and escalating fear. The banquet stabbing did not win independence, but it pierced the illusion of invincibility that sustained the plantation system. It demonstrated that resistance could emerge in the heart of power. That lesson multiplied in fields, forests, and battle lines. Revolutions are rarely born in a single moment. They grow from accumulated defiance. Each act adds weight to the next. Each memory strengthens resolve. By the time the uprising of 1791 erupted, the colony was already saturated with tension and stories of resistance. Today, when we examine the Haitian Revolution, we often focus on generals, battles, and declarations. Yet beneath those dramatic events lie quieter moments that carried equal importance. A servant standing behind a master's chair, a blade drawn in a hall filled with laughter, a crowd gathered in a square watching punishment meant to restore fear. These scenes reveal how power is maintained and how it unravels. They remind us that systems built on violence contain within them the seeds of their own collapse. The revolution of Haiti was not inevitable, but it became possible because fear changed direction. As we move toward the next chapter of this documentary, we will explore how when Haiti declared independence on January 1st, 1804, the cannons had barely fallen silent before a new battle began. It was no longer a battle fought with muskets and cane fields. It was a battle for recognition, survival, and dignity in a hostile world. The former colony of Saint-Domingue, once the richest possession of France, had transformed into Haiti, the first independent black republic in the modern world. That single fact shook the Atlantic powers. Slave-holding societies saw danger in the example. European empires saw economic loss. Political leaders saw a question they did not want to answer. If enslaved people could overthrow their masters in Haiti, what prevented similar revolutions elsewhere? The psychological shock that began in 1788 inside a banquet hall had expanded into a global crisis of confidence in slavery itself. In the United States, reactions were tense and divided. Southern plantation owners followed events in Haiti with fear. Newspapers in cities like Charleston printed alarming stories about violence and disorder. Enslaved communities in the American South quietly celebrated news of black victory. Meanwhile, political leaders debated whether to recognize the new nation. Official recognition would not come for decades. Economic interests complicated moral arguments. American merchants wanted trade with Haiti, especially access to sugar and coffee markets. Yet politicians feared angering slaveholding states. Across the Atlantic, Britain also weighed its position carefully. British forces had once tried to seize Saint-Domingue during the Revolution. Now Britain saw potential trade benefits, but hesitated to openly support a republic born from slave revolt. France responded with resentment and calculation. Napoleon had lost one of his most profitable colonies. The defeat contributed to his decision to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States in 1803. Haiti's revolution indirectly reshaped the map of North America. Yet France did not accept Haitian independence easily. In 1825, under threat of renewed invasion, France demanded an enormous indemnity as compensation for lost property, including formerly enslaved people. The sum was crushing. Haiti agreed under pressure, borrowing heavily from French banks. This debt burden drained national resources for generations. The irony was cruel. A nation born from resistance to slavery was forced to pay former slave owners for its freedom. The economic chains replaced the iron ones. Internally, Haiti faced immense challenges. The war had devastated plantations and infrastructure. Skilled administrators had fled or been killed. The new leadership, under figures like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, had to build a state from ruins. Dessalines declared himself emperor in 1804, seeking stability through strong central authority. Yet tensions persisted between different factions, including former free people of color and formerly enslaved generals. Regional rivalries deepened. After Dessalines was assassinated in 1806, Haiti split into northern and southern governments for a time. Political fragmentation added to economic hardship. The dream of freedom remained powerful, but governing a nation required more than victory in battle. Despite these struggles, Haiti's existence transformed global conversations about race and human rights. Abolitionists in Britain and the United States cited Haiti as proof that black people were capable of self-governance and military leadership. Pro-slavery advocates attempted to portray Haiti as chaotic to justify continued bondage elsewhere as the debate intensified. In Britain, the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and later the abolition of slavery in 1833, occurred within a broader Atlantic climate, influenced in part by Haiti's example. The revolution demonstrated that enslaved populations were not passive labor forces. They were political actors capable of reshaping history. Throughout Latin America, independence movements watched Haiti closely. Leaders fighting against Spanish colonial rule saw both inspiration and warning. Haiti later provided support to revolutionary figures such as Simón Bolívar, offering weapons and refuge on the condition that he would abolish slavery in territories he liberated. This act extended Haiti's revolutionary influence beyond its borders. Though economically isolated, Haiti remained symbolically powerful. It represented a break in the global order of racial hierarchy that had justified centuries of enslavement. Yet the narrative of Haiti in many Western histories became distorted over time. Textbooks often minimized its achievements or focused narrowly on violence. The deeper causes of the revolution, including the brutality of plantation life and the hypocrisy of colonial liberty claims, were sometimes softened or ignored. Memory became contested ground. Just as colonial authorities once tried to erase the identity of enslaved rebels, later narratives attempted to marginalize Haiti's role in shaping modern ideas of freedom. Recovering these stories requires careful study of archives, letters, and testimonies scattered across continents. It requires listening to voices that were long suppressed. The arc from 1788 to 1804 teaches a profound lesson about power and perception. When the servant raised his blade at a banquet in Cap Français, the elite saw only criminal defiance. They did not see the deeper currents beneath their society. They believed public execution would restore fear. Instead, it revealed vulnerability. Fear shifted. Confidence cracked. By the time revolution erupted in 1791, the colony was already trembling. The final declaration of independence was not a sudden miracle. It was the result of accumulated acts of courage, organization, and endurance. Today, Haiti continues to face political and economic challenges, shaped partly by the legacy of isolation and debt imposed after independence. Yet its revolutionary past remains a source of pride and global significance. The Haitian Revolution stands alongside the American and French revolutions as one of the great transformations of the 18th century. Unlike those revolutions, however, it was led by people who had been denied basic humanity under law. It forced the world to confront contradictions between proclaimed rights and practiced oppression. The storm that began before 1791 did not end with independence. It continues to echo in debates about justice, equality, and historical truth. And every echo traces back to moments when silence was broken and the powerless chose to act. Memory is a battlefield just as real as any plantation field that burned in 1791. After independence in 1804, the leaders of Haiti understood that survival required more than armies and laws. It required a story, a shared memory strong enough to unite people who had been divided by language, region, status, and trauma. The revolution had brought together Africans from many ethnic groups, people born on the island, free people of color, and even a few sympathetic Europeans. Once the war ended, those differences did not disappear. The new nation needed symbols that could hold it together. The story of resistance, from small acts of defiance in the 1780s to the mass uprising of 1791 and the Declaration of Independence, became the foundation of national identity. Oral traditions preserved names and moments that colonial records tried to erase. Songs carried coded references to battles and sacrifices. In rural communities, elders told stories by firelight about the days when the cane fields burned and the powerful fled in fear. In the north, near Cap Français, now called Cap Haitien, the physical landscape itself became part of memory. Ruins of plantation houses stood as silent witnesses. Some were left abandoned, their walls cracked by time and weather. Others were reused for new purposes. Each ruin reminded Haitians of what had once stood there: wealth built on suffering. The contrast between former grandeur and present freedom carried deep meaning. Children growing up in the 19th century saw these structures and heard stories of revolt. They learned that independence had not been given as a gift. It had been taken through struggle. The memory of fear shifting direction, of masters realizing they were not untouchable, became part of national consciousness. Yet outside Haiti, the memory of the revolution often followed a different path. In slaveholding societies, writers and politicians sometimes described the events in Saint-Domingue as chaos rather than liberation. They focused on violence without acknowledging the violence of slavery that preceded it. In cities like Charleston and New Orleans, strict laws were passed to prevent enslaved people from gathering or learning to read. News of Haiti circulated carefully, often distorted to discourage rebellion. The revolution became both inspiration and warning. Enslaved communities whispered about Haiti as proof that freedom was possible. Slave owners cited Haiti as justification for harsher control. Memory divided along lines of power. In Europe, intellectual debates about race and humanity were forced to confront Haiti's existence. Enlightenment thinkers had written about universal rights, but many had excluded Africans from those ideals. The success of formerly enslaved people in defeating a European army challenged racist theories of inferiority. Some scholars revised their views. Others doubled down on prejudice, arguing that Haiti's economic struggles proved incapacity rather than recognizing the crushing weight of international isolation and debt imposed by France in 1825. That indemnity, demanded as compensation for lost property, including human beings, drained Haiti's treasury for generations. The burden limited investment in infrastructure, education, and public health. When observers later pointed to poverty in Haiti, they often ignored the structural causes rooted in post-independence punishment. Memory outside Haiti became selective. Inside Haiti, leaders used commemoration to reinforce unity. National holidays celebrated January 1st. Speeches honored figures such as Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Monuments were erected. Yet political divisions sometimes shaped which heroes were emphasized. In the 19th century, conflicts between northern and southern factions influenced interpretation of revolutionary legacy. Some leaders highlighted military strength. Others emphasized agricultural renewal. The revolution was not a single story, but many stories woven together. Even debates about governance reflected deeper questions first raised in the revolutionary era. How should freedom be structured? How should labor function without slavery? How could economic survival be balanced with dignity? Scholars in the 20th and 21st centuries began to re-examine archival records more carefully. Historians studied plantation logs, court documents, ship manifests, and letters preserved in archives in Paris, London, and Madrid. They pieced together fragments that revealed the complexity of resistance before 1791. They found evidence of poison trials, sabotage, and small conspiracies. They recognized that large revolutions grow from smaller acts. In that research, events like the banquet stabbing in 1788 gained renewed significance. Even when names were obscured or altered in colonial records, patterns emerged. Enslaved domestic servants occupied positions of intimate proximity to power. They overheard conversations. They moved between rooms of authority. When such a person chose to act, the symbolism was profound. The elite's private space was no longer secure. Modern Haitian scholars and artists have also reclaimed these layered histories. Novels, poems, and paintings reinterpret the revolution with emotional depth. Musicians incorporate references to ancestral resistance into contemporary songs. Vodou ceremonies honor spirits associated with liberation. The wooded site remembered as Bois Cayman remains a powerful symbol, even though historians debate precise details of what occurred there in 1791. Symbolic truth can coexist with archival uncertainty. What matters is the shared recognition that unity formed in those woods contributed to a transformation that reshaped the Atlantic world. International perspectives have shifted gradually. In recent decades, global historians have placed the Haitian Revolution alongside the American and French revolutions as one of the defining upheavals of the late 18th century. They argue that without Haiti, the history of democracy and human rights is incomplete. The revolution exposed contradictions within Enlightenment ideals. It forced empires to confront the limits of their power. It influenced abolitionist movements and colonial policies. Even the sale of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, which doubled the size of the United States, was connected to France's defeat in Saint-Domingue. Haiti's story is woven into the fabric of modern history more deeply than many textbooks once acknowledged. Still, memory remains fragile. Political instability, natural disasters, and economic hardship in Haiti sometimes overshadow discussion of its revolutionary achievements. Media coverage often focuses on crisis rather than context. Yet for Haitians, the revolution is not distant history. It is a source of identity and resilience. It is a reminder that ancestors faced conditions far harsher and still prevailed. The narrative of fear changing direction, of the oppressed standing against empire, continues to inspire. As we reflect on the journey from 1788 through 1791 and into 1804, we see how individual and collective memory intertwine. A blade drawn in a banquet hall signaled that obedience had limits. A public execution meant to silence dissent instead amplified it. A gathering in the woods united scattered grievances. Battles against European armies confirmed resolve. Independence declared to a hostile world affirmed humanity. Each stage built upon the last. The story of Haiti challenges us to reconsider how history is told, whose voices are preserved, whose actions are minimized. It asks whether we view revolutions only through the lens of European capitals, or whether we recognize transformations born in colonies. It reminds us that ideas of liberty gain meaning when claimed by those most denied them. And it shows that memory, when nurtured, can sustain identity even through hardship. In the final chapter of this documentary, we will bring together the threads of resistance, revolution, memory, and modern legacy. We will return to the image of 1788, to the banquet hall where confidence first cracked, and trace the line forward to today. Because history is not only about what happened, it is about how those events continue to shape the present. History often begins with a whisper before it becomes a roar. In 1788, inside a glittering banquet hall in Cap Français, now known as Cap Haitien, a single act shattered the illusion of absolute control. The plantation system of Saint-Domingue had been built on certainty. White colonists believed their wealth, backed by the power of France, guaranteed permanence. They believed the Code Noir and armed militias could silence any challenge. They believed the enslaved were too broken to resist in meaningful ways. Yet when a trusted servant raised a blade before elite guests, that belief cracked. The sound that echoed through that hall was more than a scream. It was the sound of fear changing direction. From that moment forward, the masters knew something they could never unknow. They were vulnerable. The years that followed proved how powerful that realization could become. In 1789, revolution shook France itself. Words like liberty and equality traveled across oceans. In 1791, flames swept through the northern plains of Saint-Domingue. What began as scattered resistance transformed into coordinated uprising. Cane fields burned, plantations collapsed, enslaved men and women claimed agency over their own destinies. Leaders such as Toussaint Louverture emerged with extraordinary strategic skill. Later, figures like Jean-Jacques Dessalines carried the struggle forward when betrayal and foreign invasion threatened to reverse hard-won gains. The Haitian Revolution was not a sudden explosion without roots. It was the culmination of decades of suffering, resistance, and psychological shifts. The banquet stabbing of 1788 stands as one of those early ruptures that revealed the fragility of the colonial order. When independence was declared on January 1st, 1804, the world witnessed something unprecedented. The colony that had generated immense wealth through enslaved labor became Haiti, the first independent black republic. It was the only successful large-scale slave revolt in modern history. That victory reshaped global politics. It influenced the sale of the Louisiana Territory. It intensified debates about abolition. It terrified slaveholding societies across the Americas. Yet Haiti paid a heavy price for its courage. International isolation and the crushing indemnity demanded by France in 1825 burdened the young nation economically for generations. Despite hardship, Haiti's existence challenged racist assumptions and forced the world to confront contradictions between proclaimed ideals and practiced oppression. Today, when we look back at the arc from 1788 to 1804 and beyond, we see more than violence and war. We see transformation. We see how memory can travel through whispers in markets, through songs in fields, through stories told to children beside ruins of former plantations. We see how a system built on fear can unravel when fear no longer flows in only one direction. The Haitian Revolution reminds us that history is not shaped only in royal courts or European capitals. It is shaped in kitchens, in cane fields, in hidden gatherings, and sometimes in banquet halls where confidence turns to shock. The story we have followed across these chapters is not merely about one act of defiance. It is about the awakening of a people who refused to remain property. As we close this documentary, we return to the question that lingers beneath every revolution. What changes first, the law or the mind? In Saint-Domingue, minds began to change before laws did. Enslaved people recognized their own strength. Masters recognized their own vulnerability. Once that balance shifted, events moved with unstoppable force. The independence of Haiti stands as proof that even the most entrenched systems can fall. It stands as testimony to courage forged in unimaginable conditions, and it challenges us, even now, to examine where fear still shapes power in our world. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time right now. If you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe and like this channel so more hidden stories can be uncovered. History lives when we remember it.